This week, we're going to look at a consultation that Nottingham Council is having on sort of effectively how to regenerate. I'm not sure how much of this is regenerating after COVID or regenerating after Brexit or regenerating because everything's going down the pan. But in any case, it's probably the same kind of consultations are probably relevant to councils up and down the UK at the moment. As people start to try and see what the shock of COVID is going to be, and basically people try to figure out, okay, how do we address this? So Brian, you've written a series of sort of responses to the Nottingham consultation that may also have wider sort of relevance to people. So perhaps, I mean, if you outline what you've done, and then we'll dive into it.
Yeah, okay. The Nottingham consultation is going on from about a week ago to early in January, and I've written a 5-part response to it, because it's a consultation where what you're supposed to do is respond in one of these tick box exercises where you have virtually no scope to say anything whatsoever, except a little box at the end of the consultation thing where you've got about space for 200 words. So I thought, well, one of the things about this consultation, it's supposed to be about Nottingham as a rebel city, so as a sort of make it culturally romantic. So I thought, well, let's rebel against this faux consultation exercise and make it a real consultation exercise by actually writing a lengthy paper, distributing it around Nottingham, and then having something like this discussion where the real issues can come out and we can make a proper open discussion about it. So that was the kind of idea for this. In theory, it is a response to the situation after the COVID pandemic, whenever it's over. But in fact, it's clearly, if you read, well, in my view, there's lots of the problems in Nottingham, the Nottingham economy, which predate the COVID situation, and will still be there and probably getting worse after the COVID situation. So you can't really discuss these things without looking at the bigger picture. And the consultation document is produced, in theory anyway, by 2 committees who've come together. One of these committees is called the Degrowth Board, and the other one is called One Nottingham. So there's 2 committees which have got a wide cross-section of people on them, not just the city council. There's people from the county council, the universities, youth groups, women's centre, on one Nottingham committee, and then on the other one there's again the city council, the county council, the 2 universities, and particularly the business school bits of those universities, but also local businesses like Experian, which is a credit agency, like Boots, which is still a major player in the Nottingham economy, like a number of cultural organisations, people associated with Nottingham Castle as a museum. So it's a wide range of groups in these 2 committees that produced this consultative paper. And what I've done is I worked through a number of issues that I thought were important. And perhaps the most important issue of all is, as this one of the committees is called the Growth Board, is growth in Nottingham economy and generally, is it even possible anymore, and is it desirable anymore? So there's the whole issue of degrowth, which I know you and I have had many thoughts and many discussions about.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the idea of growth in sort of environmental circles is a no-no at this point. If the aim is to get to some, which I think is actually not going to happen anyway, but the idea of net zero, that adding growth at this point is the very last thing you need to do, because growth comes with carbon attached. I think in many ways there's the economic question then as to, is it possible? I think increasingly, no, it isn't. We are not looking at a situation of growth, certainly in the immediate future. We're looking at a very likely stagnation, where the degrowth perspective is much more, well, how do we manage this period where we're actually going into reverse, as it were? Because we either do it that way or we go into the mother of all recessions, and it can go anywhere from there.
Yeah, that's absolutely. I mean, I thought you might say something like that. The thing about this consultation, though, is that if you look at it, it doesn't contain any economic analysis whatsoever. None. In fact, it's a plan which is based on taking, be kind here, the pet projects of a number of different agencies, like the kind of cultural museum in Nottingham, and what I suppose the financial sector in Nottingham, particularly Experian and so on, would like to see in the way of promoting financial technology, and probably the property developer section, how they would like to see the city reshaped in the view of the fact that they've now got a hell of a lot of vacant buildings, and what they're going to do with these things. And then there's the universities, the business schools, and the young people coming out of the business schools with huge debts. What are they going to do with their lives? Well, from the Nottingham plan, they're obviously going to become entrepreneurs. That's the basic idea. And then there's everybody else. Well, they need more skills. They need more training. So it's actually not an economic analysis at all. It's a collection of a ragbag of projects which are not based on anything at all. And what I find alarming about this, and quite upsetting about this, is that there's not only is there no economic analysis, there's no analysis of what's already gone wrong. And in Nottingham, what's already gone wrong is that the council lost, I think, about 37 million, something like that, when a company called Robin Hood Energy crashed, burned. And they lost another 7 million when it's a second shopping centre in Nottingham was being redeveloped, but the company that owned the shopping centre, it became bankrupt, and so the whole project collapsed. So there's nothing in this consultation exercise about that, and yet both of these projects have profound implications for the future of Nottingham, and they say a lot about the economic prospects in the future. I know you've written on both of these topics. Like, for example, you've written on the prospects for shopping quite a lot.
Or the lack thereof.
Yeah, exactly.
Thereof.
And so
it struck me that.
Go on, sorry.
It struck me that there are similarities between your experience with Nottingham and the sort of ongoing problems that we have in Wales, or that we used to have in Wales, in relation to European funding. Because you have these organizations that become sort of corporate welfare recipients, There'll be branches of local government, the sort of voluntary sector agencies, sort of various arm's length Quango type bodies, and they bring in private sector partners. But the whole thing is about how do we milk government for money that we then pay ourselves. So the classic ones were the 1980s ones that were about alleviating poverty. So we'll have all of these projects. In South Wales, we had the closure of the steel and the mining industry. There's similarities there with Nottingham. So you started having all of these agencies set up that were going to provide the jobs for miners and steel workers. And of course they didn't. What they did was developed very nice, very comfortable middle-class jobs for themselves. But they somehow never got round to providing the employment on the ground. What they did manage to do was, through a huge lobbying effort, was to convince the politicians that they were essential. That, how dare you close us down? We are providing employment and solving poverty. But of course they never did. Now, it won't be written down in this way, but certainly critics of the way European funding was handled in Wales have argued that a part of your project's ability to get money from Europe depended on it being a crock of shite. That basically the last thing we want to fund is something that is going to take off and genuinely provide employment and genuinely increase the economy. Because if we do that, then we will fall out of the category of regions of the European Union that get the money. That became a particular issue after the Eastern European countries joined the European Union, where it became important to make sure that areas of Wales were as poor as areas of Romania, because we've got to keep that money flowing in. And yeah, you had people on 100,000 a year as CEOs of these sort of corporate welfare recipients, who would write lovely glowing reports about all these things that they were going to do to kind of make everything better, but somehow it never got any better. Add to that, I suppose, which probably you'll get in your consultation, the obligatory bypasses and all of the other things that local councils want money for. Because that was almost the way we did it in the 80s, that because we haven't got any jobs here, we'll build a dual carriageway to where there are some jobs and we'll get them there. And of course, what that did was all of the best qualified and best working people moved away. Because there's a limit to how long you travel up and down that dual carriageway before you buy a house where the work is. So essentially a lot of these plans are much more about how do we keep the corporate welfare recipients in work, as opposed to how do we genuinely restructure our economy to deal with the conditions we now face.
You're bringing back some memories there, actually, when you say that. I mean, I live in an area which is just not very far away from what was, I can't even remember the name of the program, but essentially the program was to regenerate an area. And I recall what it actually did is it did up a number of factories and turned them into student accommodation. The students were not people who ever lived in the area anyway. And for a long time, it was just essentially a way of giving some officials a huge amount of money and so they could drive around in big cars. And it did absolutely nothing for the area at all. I mean, I remember thinking it would have been better to give the money directly to the people living in the area with the proviso that they use it for something that would be useful, like childcare or training or something like that. But no, it all went into the officials with the big cars and then into the regeneration of a number of, using a number of empty factories. But I mean, I think there's more that we can say here, which are particularly about the way in which shopping is going down the pan, because people simply don't have the expenditure for the purchasing power left after they paid the bills, after they paid the tax, after they paid their rising energy bills, particularly. I think that's this business of the retail apocalypse. You've written a lot about that. Could you say something?
Yeah, and I mean we've seen it writ large. For anyone that's paying attention, if you look at what's happening on high streets up and down the UK as a result of the COVID crisis, that we've seen a massive acceleration of the number of stores going bankrupt. I mean, I know some of them have sort of, will be back after the crisis signs on the door, but the reality is they ain't coming back. And that is, basically, it's to do with purchasing power as well as, so if you like, you can blame the crisis because that's easy. Well, because we've all been locked in our houses, we haven't been out shopping, therefore that's why they've closed. But it was a process that was already unfolding. I mean, I've been writing about it for the last 5 years. If you think back to names like Woolworths, think of Peacocks, I think, are one of the latest ones to go, Bon Marché. There's something called Edinburgh Woolen Mills, which is actually an umbrella body that owns lots of store brands that they've just gone under. So you're going back over the last 5 years, there have been big name brands that were already going under. All the COVID response has done is to accelerate that process. But the problem with it, I mean, purchasing power out of the economy, we've taken billions out by laying off tens, if not hundreds of thousands of workers. The latest figures from the Office of National Statistics, I think they're right that they're using payroll figures now as the better measure than the unemployment figure itself, because they've sort of so fiddled what counts as being unemployed that it's almost a meaningless figure. So basically anybody that's doing more than an hour's work in a week is considered to be employed. And it's got all kinds of qualifications. If you're claiming benefits, you have to be actively looking for work. So what Office of National Statistics did earlier this week was produce figures saying, well, how many people were on the payroll back in February and how many people are on the payroll now? And it turns out there's 800,000 fewer people on the payroll now than there were then. Point being, that doesn't include the people who are on furlough, who are still counted as being on the payroll. So these are 800,000 people, despite the furlough scheme and despite all of the various grants and loans, and 800,000 people have lost their jobs over that period. I think there's people starting to talk about this idea of a furlough cliff, that when the furlough finishes, there's going to be perhaps another million or so on top of that who are going to lose their jobs as well. If you like, their employers are keeping them on the books for now in the hope that something turns up. But when it comes time to open up again, if demand isn't there, then people are going to be laid off very quickly. And in part, that's taken money out, or purchasing power out of the economy, which again was something that was ongoing. I mean, the average wage in Britain certainly hasn't got back to its pre-2008 levels yet. I mean, it started to get, I think it got back to about 2010 levels at Christmas last year. So we just got back to where we were in 2010, then COVID comes along and splats it all. But we are now in a position where there just isn't the demand to support the consumption that we had. Therefore, any analysis of what we do next that's based on, essentially we'll just do what we did last time round, just isn't going to work.
If I can relate all this to the business of the other company that crashed, Robin Hood Energy, what you're describing is a process that was already happening, that people were getting poorer, while the transformation of the energy system, the electricity supply system, meant that things were getting more expensive to provide. It's absolutely fantastic that the government is trying to transform the energy system and the technologies and so on, but there's a number of problems, very severe problems, not the least of which is it's much more expensive. And Robin Hood Energy was actually set up by the Nottingham City Council in, I think it was in 2016, with the idea of helping the people who were poorest in the energy market. And then what happened to Robin Hood Energy? It crashed, but it wasn't the only one that crashed. It crashed, was one of 20 companies that went bankrupt between 2016 and this year. And 8 others didn't actually go bankrupt, but withdrew from that energy market. So on the one hand, you've got people getting poorer, and on the other hand, you get electricity and the electricity supply system becoming more expensive to operate, and people were falling out of the process. And of course, you've got also the people who are relatively wealthy, they can kind of partially opt out as well by putting solar panels on their roofs. Good thing that they put solar panels on their roofs from an environmental point of view up to a point. But of course, by them opting out, the actual amount of money which is going to the energy supply companies, the retail energy supply companies, goes down. And so we're not, one of the things that really bugs me about the crash of Robinhood Energy in Nottingham was the way it all focused on what the councillors were doing wrong and how bad they were as business people, and the issues of governance, but nobody actually did an economic analysis to express this very simple idea that energy costs are going up and people are getting poorer. So inevitably, companies go bust. And 28 of them, well, 20 did, and 8 got out. So the point about this is you need to know this, because you need to know that the energy system's in a mess and the problems aren't going to get any better.
Yeah, I mean, the problem that we have with that is we're being sold this narrative, this idea of a fourth industrial revolution where we're going to run the world on solar panels and wind turbines. I think a lot of people have bought into that idea. Part of the problem with Robinhood Energy and with a lot of these sort of new energy startups was they failed to take into account just how the price of wholesale electricity fluctuates. So they looked at, okay, if we can get wind power at a time where the windmills are turning and the wind is blowing, that sometimes that electricity is actually, it goes negative in price, that you're actually paid to take it off the grid. And there are actually schemes now at a grid level where big industries are paid to use electricity. We have too much wind, we can't do anything with it. Please do more of whatever you do. Leave all your lights on and we'll pay you for doing it. Now, the problem with the startup companies was they thought that they could attract all of the customers by offering the lowest possible price, failing to see that actually, well, okay, while the wholesale price goes negative when the wind is blowing, have a look what happens when the wind stops blowing, like it did here last week. Because then you find that the price per kilowatt goes up into the thousands. There is a scrambling round to desperately find enough electricity to meet demand. And again, they have to pay the big industrial users in that case to stop using. So you compensate them. So all of it comes with these costs built in. I mean, whether or not these startup energy people knew this, I don't know. So as you say, that economic analysis is absent. Certainly people that comment on what's going on in the electricity industry do know it. And I guess a local council should have done its homework and checked. Because any of these sort of startup things where you get, I mean, it's almost like a tulip bulb mania that, there are these new electricity companies starting up and we've all got to go and invest in them and isn't it great? That should ring alarm bells. And it should do that in any sector of the economy where there's a sudden, sort of, hey, look, we're all going to get rich quickly, or in our case, we're going to save money. That your first question should be, what's the catch?
One of the things in my one of my responses to the city is to say, if we want to look at what's going to happen in the future, and we need to prepare the economy, we need to prepare the economy for the fact that energy supply, electricity supply will be intermittent. It's all very well to say, we're going to transform the energy supply from fossil fuels, gas, coal, and so on, to wind and solar. But if you carry that all the way through and you turn off completely the gas and the coal, then the wind isn't always blowing and the sun isn't always shining. And the point which most people don't understand is that the cost of storing energy from the windy or the sunny days, the cost of storing energy is actually huge. There's a real affordability crisis for that part of the technological transformation that has to happen. You can store some energy from a sunny midday in summer to later in the evening. But what you can't do is store a huge amount of energy from those parts of the year when the wind and the sun is there generating it, to those parts of the year where you have long periods of calm but very cold weather in the middle of winter. You can't store energy on a big enough scale seasonally. And that's going to be a real issue in the future. And nobody has yet got an affordable solution for that. So what it means is if you carry this energy transformation all the way through, you end up with an intermittent economy. Now, there are, to some degree, technological options for you. For example, the organisation that I work with in Ireland called FASTA has been looking at the whole issue of a FASTA website which is intermittent. There's a website by the Low Technology magazine which is based in Barcelona, and that's intermittent as well. You can look at their website and it might not be there because there hasn't been enough sun or there hasn't been enough wind around Barcelona. But they're kind of working at that. So I think there are issues like that that really have to be looked at for the future. And the point is that if you want a high energy future, the transformation to that kind of economy is going to be really, really difficult. So you're going to have to look at the way in which the economy is going to change in the future as part and parcel of an economic strategy. And it's issues like this are just totally missing in this economic strategy report.
Yeah, that goes back to, as I said, this myth that we're being sold to the fourth industrial revolution. The idea that we're all going to have our plug-in electric flying cars and it's all going to be wonderful because it'll run on solar power. I think the more people buy into that, and clearly the politicians do because it's popular. I don't know that you're going to get elected by standing up in front of people and telling them that basically everything about the way you're living is going to change because you're not going to be able to have the kind of routine that you currently have. So simple things like just being able to go to the shops. Well, supermarkets can't function if their electricity goes off. You have problems with food storage because for health and safety reasons, if their freezers go off for any length of time, they're not going to be able to sell the food that was in them. So you probably have to change the regulations to a degree, but they certainly won't be able to take any money off you because very few people are transacting in cash anymore. So something that you take for granted. If you like, there's a part of the way I live, even though I tend to live fairly frugally, there is part of my mentality that says that all I've got to do is get on my bike, ride for about 20 minutes around the corner, and there will be a supermarket and it will be open. And sort of fairly good chance that it will have whatever it is that I need to go and buy. In an intermittent economy, you can't have that certainty. So then you've got to start finding ways of, well, when do I do my shopping? You have the problem when you get it home here as well, that your freezer may not work. So again, okay, how am I going to prepare and store food in that circumstance? And those are things that people, certainly if you're a politician, you're not going to win an election telling people that's the life we're going to have to lead. It's far easier to tell everyone that, yes, we'll power everything with wind turbines. I think the latest one that's doing, I think the European Union have been big on it and the British are picking up on it, is the idea that we're going to use the excess electricity when the wind is blowing to use electrolysis on water to turn it into hydrogen. And then we're going to use the hydrogen effectively as a battery for capturing that excess electricity. And then we'll be able to wean ourselves off natural gas entirely and we'll use the hydrogen instead. And again, whoever drew up that paper did not look at the volumes of natural gas that are being used compared to the volume of hydrogen you can get from the excess wind. Because the excess wind hydrogen is going to be a tiny fraction of the amount of gas we currently use. So again, we're going to be asking people to basically, if the wind ain't blowing, you're not going to be allowed to cook. And if your house is reliant on gas and we're supplying hydrogen to keep you warm, then I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to be warm in the winter because we ain't got enough to go round. These are not easy things to solve. I mean, they need solving. But I think instead people are buying this sort of, utopia of just put up a few more wind turbines and it'll be fine. And yes, wind turbines are a great thing in their place. But they're not the answer. I mean, if the answer is how do we keep the economy we've got, then wind turbines and solar panels are not the answer to that question. If the answer is how do we grow the economy that we've got, then they certainly aren't the answer to it. So go back to the drawing board, because essentially you are going to need to find an energy dense source of fuel that is more powerful by a long way than oil and gas.
Yeah, I think the other thing you need to go back to the drawing board about is your food supply. Because food production is an extraordinarily energy intensive process, not just the production, but the transport and the refrigeration, which you were talking about earlier, and so on. And that means that if your energy supply is in difficulty, your food production system is also in difficulty, and you need a low energy way of producing. And that low energy way of producing food is going to be the organic approach and the local approach, that you don't need to transport your food over a long distance. I mean, one of the things that I think about Nottingham is that in the 19th century, Nottingham, about a third of the population of the industrial city in the middle of the 19th century had a garden or had a share in a garden or allotment, and grew a large proportion of their own food, supplemented their diet. I'm not suggesting that everybody grows all of their own food, but what I am suggesting is that that kind of process and that kind of need to supplement your food production, particularly vegetables and fruit and so on, is something which is going to have to be looked at. And also redeveloping the relationship between local consumers and local farmers. The links with local farmers need developing. I mean, for example, on the east of the city, there used to be a lot of market gardeners who provided a lot of the fruit and vegetables for the city. And those kind of things need to be redeveloped. Ironically, it's the artists who got this idea more than the politicians. There's an arts centre near here where there's a bakery there, and the farmers market functions there, and you put in your order via the internet, and the farmer will deliver, and you can pick up. So that, and also there are discussions between the bakery and local millers and local farmers about production and the kind of grains which are going to grow well in a changing climate and grow well in the area we live in. So there are innovations going on. It's just that the politicians haven't picked up on them and aren't promoting them. So I'm not that pessimistic, although I'm not looking forward to Brexit in early January. It's something we haven't talked about. I don't know whether you've got a view on that.
Yeah, it'll give us a chance to practice for when the effects of the COVID restrictions hit home. I mean, we get a chance to have a few months of going hungry before the rest of the world gets. On a serious note, yes, I mean, Brexit will be a shock to the economy. I think even if they get a deal, which is still on the table at the moment, it is only a deal in the trading goods. So you've already lost free movement of people, free movement of capital, and free movement of services, which is where most of the British people work. So all a trade deal is going to work with is stuff that Britain actually makes, and we don't do a lot of making things, although I suspect we may have to in the future. But for the moment, I mean, that to me signals a very big restructuring of the UK economy, because it means that we're going to have to make a lot more things here, and things that we don't make here just aren't going to be available. That, I think, takes us from the kind of consumerism that we've been locked into for the last, 50 years, of buy it cheap, use it, throw it away, then buy another one, buy it cheap, use it, throw it away. That this pushes us down a road much more of buy something that is of high quality manufacture that lasts you for a lifetime or as close to a lifetime as you can get it. So if
made by people with crafts, handcrafts.
Yes, whether it has to be entirely by hand, but I mean, the point is it has to be made to last. And if that means that we've all got to pay extra to afford that sort of stuff, that means actually rejigging the income structures as well, because you're not going to be able to have all of the people down in the City of London earning multiples of what everyone else earns, and then the rest of us being impoverished, because that kind of quality economy cannot run on that basis. I mean, I like Richard Heinberg's point, that he reckons the reason we've got the inequality that we have is entirely due to fossil fuels. That it was basically only the surplus energy that we had left over from fossil fuels that allowed that kind of gulf to open up. That if you went back to pre-industrial societies, yes, you had rich and poor, but there was never that kind of enormous gap. The idea that someone like Jeff Bezos can sit there on trillions of dollars a year while people are starving around the world, that wouldn't have been possible back in the Middle Ages. And that actually the odds are a lot of ordinary people in the developed countries probably enjoy lifestyles now that are better than what kings in the Middle Ages enjoyed. So yes, all of us have that material, well, all of us in the developed world have enjoyed that kind of living standard. Although, probably since about 1973, 74, we've been losing people off the bottom of the income scale in the West. And actually a large part of why Brexit is about to happen is because we ignored all of the people that were dropping off the bottom. I think it's Guy Standing came up with the idea of a precariat, that you no longer had a working class at the bottom. You had a group of people who were in and out of the benefit system. You had a benefit system that was no longer adequate to keep people out of poverty, then people bouncing into 0 hours jobs or gig economies in the new sort of feudal, neo-feudal, digital feudalism, and never having enough actually to live decently. I think over the years that group grew and the bottom end of the working class fell away and nobody really noticed. They did, but all of the politicians and the decision makers sort of chose to believe that we were living in a kind of post-capitalist society where there weren't those people at the bottom. And then they made the mistake of saying, would you like us to stay or leave the European Union? And for once they gave those people an equal vote with everyone else, and they voted for it. And they voted to say, well, we'd like to take back control of our politics because we think that's the best way of sort of addressing our situation. I don't think it is, but I can fully understand why, possibly even out of desperation, you'd decide that, let's vote for that because at least it disrupts.
Yeah, and what to say about that, if you look at this plan, what's called a plan, what you actually got is a plan for graduates, mostly, graduate artists who don't actually do very well in financial terms, but anyway, for graduates, and for people coming out of business schools and the universities and so on. Whereas it's almost an afterthought about the people in the rest of Nottingham who are in the precariat. The industrial employment for these people has sort of disappeared over the years that I've been here since the 1970s, almost completely disappeared. And basically what they're supposed to do is to retrain and then get new jobs in the growth sectors. This is what this plan says. And I say, what growth sectors would they be? And what actually happening, as you say, is that there's an increasing number of people in the precariat, and they're the people that are using the food banks. And if you want an economic indicator which is relevant for Nottingham, you would do that economic indicator on the people who are using food banks. And you would do something about, you would try and link that to this whole business about growing more, making it easier for people to get a hold of nutritious food in the city. And that's not happening. But to switch back again to the people who are really rich, I mean, can we just perhaps finish by talking a little bit about banking and finance, because we haven't really talked about that very much. And the reason I mention this is because there is this big thing in this plan about financial technology. You mentioned the financial technology, and I mentioned about the business of intermittency will be in real trouble if the wind's not blowing and the electricity goes off and so on. But the whole business about the finance sector is quite important. We talked about the City of London very briefly there. The point is, if the economy is going down, there is no future for the finance sector as a generality, because the finance sector is based on the fact that you want the money paid back, and you want the money paid back with interest. So that implies that your income is going up, which is okay for the last 200, 250 years. But it just so happens that it doesn't look as if the energy is there for growth to continue. I know we've talked recently about the way in which the information from the United States is that in the United States next year, it may be that oil production will fall by anything up to 2/3, 3/4. And that's, if there isn't any energy to grow the economy, then the finance sector is in real trouble.
Yeah, the finance sector is in trouble, full stop. There's a lovely set of statistics that Tim Morgan has on his website. It's, if you go back to the period immediately after the Second World War, that for every dollar that you borrowed into the economy, you got something like $5 or $10 back in genuine economic growth. Whereas you fast forward to today, and for every dollar, you basically have to borrow $3 into existence to get $1 back. Which is almost a definition of financial unsustainability. And because we borrow the currency into existence with interest attached, we have to have growth. Because what this is showing you is that, well, whereas we had enormous growth in the aftermath of the Second World War, and largely because oil extraction grew exponentially between 1945 and 1973, as long as it was growing exponentially, we were able to have that sort of exponential growth in interest rates and exponential growth in profit. And we had this one period in history where ordinary working people's share of the profits grew. So anyone fortunate enough, I mean, it isn't quite the baby boomers. They make these artificial, sort of delineation points. There were people that were born in the late 30s who probably should be included as baby boomers. And there are people that were born in the late 50s and early 60s whose life experience is more close to the Generation X. So if you were born in 1959-60, you left school just in time for Thatcher to come along and screw everything over. So that wasn't the kind of baby boomer, everything's getting better. That was, oh shit, time to put the brakes on. Oil globally stopped growing exponentially in 1973. Artificially so because of the politics of the Middle East, but it would have ceased growing exponentially at some point in the 70s anyway. After that, oil is only growing in a linear way. The problem you've got with that is you can't support the exponential growth in interest rates with only a linear growth in energy, because basically there just ain't the energy to go round to do all of the things that you need to do in order to grow the economy to pay it back.
But we've had North Sea oil, though, haven't we? I mean, that made a major impact on the British economy, and the kind of idea was that Thatcher was brought in these wonderful economic policies which set the British economy right. Did she hell? What she was the beneficiary of North Sea oil, and that's what set the economy right, and that underpinned the Big Bang in the City of London. The City of London, of course, had discovered that the best way of making money was to work with a network of tax havens, which provided bolt holes for some of the world's biggest financial crooks and criminals. And so you had sterling as a petrocurrency, the network of secrecy jurisdictions and bolt holes for criminals. And that was what created the prosperity of this country for a while. But that's all come. But that, as you know, that's all come to an end now, isn't it? Nearly it's come to an end.
Yeah, in a way, part of what Brexit was about was since the Second World War, Britain became money launderers to the world. What benefited us was there were a hell of a lot of people behind the Iron Curtain who needed to get hold of dollars, but couldn't, for political reasons, open bank accounts directly in the States, because that would leave them open to sanctions. So instead, they were able to go through the City of London and the various tax havens to move that money around. And Britain got rich effectively taking dodgy money from behind the Iron Curtain and laundering it through the various tax havens into what appeared to be clean money. Now, part of the problem with Europe was that Europe came along and says, well, we're not benefiting from that. So we think we ought to regulate your banking system, which is where all of the people like Rees-Mogg and Duncan Smith and all of these characters are hostile to Europe from. What I don't think they ever expected was that enough of the people in the precariat would vote with them to actually make Brexit real. But going back to Thatcher, yes, I mean, by using North Sea oil, she was able to underpin that money laundering system, but at the cost of sacrificing British industry, because the oil effectively made the pound far more overvalued than it ever should have been. And to an extent, we still have that you have a currency that is valued against the City of London. It means that anything that we try manufacturing for export in the UK is uncompetitive compared to the competitor countries. Particularly Germany, because it now, through the euro, effectively devalues its currency by using Southern Europe. I mean, if Germany was still trading in Deutschmarks, the Deutschmark would be worth far more than the euro. So in effect, Germany is able to fiddle the euro system to sell BMWs to the world far cheaper than they otherwise would be. So Britain lost its industry in part in the 1980s because the pound was overvalued. The problem is that, if you like, the whole thing was premised on North Sea oil never running out. And there's a kind of geological problem with that one. I mean, it's kind of like having a magic bottle of beer. Magic bottle of beer that never runs out. Yeah. I mean, the trouble is it runs out. It's great while you've got it. The hangover is a big problem. So fast forward to today, you're in a position where we ceased to be an exporter of oil and gas back in 2005. So we've become increasingly reliant largely on Russia, or Russia and Norway. For the time being, Norway is being nice to us. So basically we have to find a way of paying in dollars to people that supply us, and we don't have much that we can convert into dollars. So if you like, the British have that extra problem on their financial system over and above the world's problem, which is that you've overprinted debt to the point that nobody can ever pay it off. So the question becomes, how are we going to solve this overprinting of currency? So we will do it in one of two ways, and possibly both of them. So the one is that we take all of the assets that make people like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos multi-billionaires, and we devalue them. We just say, well, they are paper assets that are worth nothing. So we can do that. The other thing we can do is we inflate it away. So basically, governments print as much currency as they like, and they hand it all out to us through various spending schemes or through universal basic incomes or whatever you choose to do it with. But you then you're almost on a conveyor where the more you print, the more you devalue. The more you devalue, the more the price of everything goes up, so the more you have to print. And basically, we'll have to keep doing that until all of the debt has been inflated away. The logical, if you like, a sort of more degrowth version would be Steve Keen's idea, where you create new currency, but you use it directly to pay off the debt, which is actually far too sensible for anyone in politics to do. but that's probably the one way that you get out of it in a managed way.
Yeah, I use a bit of advert from my book Credo, which I published in 2015. There's a chapter in there which is essentially that. You create shed loads of money, you give it to everybody equally on the basis of the fact that if you've got debts, say to organizations, companies which are registered with the Financial Services Authority, then you have to use this money to pay down your debts. And if you don't have debts, then you have to use this money for some purpose, like investing in a renewable energy company or in home insulation or something like that, which relates to the energy crisis. We've come a long way on this discussion, a very long way. What I hope we've shown to people watching, who hopefully there'll be a lot of people from Nottingham watching, is that the Nottingham growth plan or the Nottingham renewable plan doesn't have any of this. It doesn't have any of this, and the reason it doesn't have any of this we touched on earlier, because as you said, politicians seem to be completely incapable of giving people bad news. And because they're completely incapable of talking about difficulties and bad news, we're kind of wandering into a future where things are going to get dramatically worse very quickly, and people are going to wonder what the hell is going on. And we're desperately unprepared for this situation. So I've written this commentary on some, not all, but some of the issues that we've talked about. And at the end of this video, you can find the web links for where you can find some of these commentaries. And I hope people will look at them, and I hope we can have a proper consultation about a really serious economic situation there that is coming down the track, so it's very quickly. So thanks, Jim. Thanks very much.